Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and today's book talk, The Book of Reykjavik, with Björn Halldórsson, Kristín Eiríksdóttir, and translator Larissa Kyzer. The book is a collection of short stories by 10 Icelandic authors about the city of Reykjavik, published by Kama Press with support from the Icelandic Literature Center. This is a part of the Kama Press Reading the City series that celebrates the best translated short stories from around the world. Since 2006, Kama Press has sourced a selection of 10 authors from specific cities to collate 10 short stories and depict social, historical, and political essence of their contemporary cities. Each story is translated for the first time into English and then published, so that each anthology is a city in short fiction. I would like to say a big thank you to Kama Press, and in particular, Becca Parkinson and Zoe Turner for helping making this event possible. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on the website at scandinavias.org, as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. A link to where one can purchase a book at Kama Press will be also added to the chat box. And the link also contains some interesting articles and podcasts about the book. Moderating today's talk is Halla Þórlaug Óskarsdóttir. She has worked with culture for the past 10 years as a writer and cultural journalist for radio and newspaper, where she mostly focuses on literature, visual arts, and cultural analysis. She is a writer herself, and her most recent work, Quiet Game, was awarded the Meisterna Prize for Best Icelandic Poetry and published in 2020. She has also written for theater, both stage and radio. So please welcome Halla.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us to this webinar where we will discuss the Book of Reykjavik with two of the book's authors, as mentioned before, and one of the translators. My name is Halla Þórlaug, and I'm happy to be here moderating this chat. I'd like to begin by introducing the participants. First, Kristín Eiríksdóttir is an award-winning novelist, short story writer, poet, and a playwright from Reykjavík, Iceland. Her original edition of A Fist or a Heart won the Icelandic Literary Prize 2017, as well as the Icelandic Women's Literature Prize 2018, and was nominated for the Nordic Council Literature Prize in 2019. Kristín Eiríksdóttir has published 7 books and has had 3 plays staged. Björn Halldórsson was born in Reykjavík, Iceland in 1983. He studied English and American literature at the University of East Anglia in Norwich and has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Glasgow. Björn Halldórsson's short stories have been published by literary journals in Iceland and the UK and have also appeared in translation in English, German, Italian, and Hebrew. His first book, a short story collection titled Smáglæpir, Misdemeanors, was published in 2017. His second book, Stól, or Loss, a novel, was published in early 2021 by Icelandic publisher Forlagið. No picture. Translator Larissa Kyzer is a writer and Icelandic to English literary translator. Her translation of Kristín Eiríksdóttir's A Fist or a Heart was awarded the American Scandinavian Foundation's 2019 Translation Prize. The same year, she was one of Princeton University's translators in residency. In 2020, Larissa co-founded Athenthorn, a chapbook press dedicated to Icelandic poetry and short fiction in translation. She is co-chair of PEN America's Translation Committee and runs the virtual Women Plus in Translation reading series. Jill. Welcome, y'all. First of all, I have to say with the Book of Reykjavik, I was really impressed with a collection of stories. It captures a very hard to describe Icelandic atmosphere. So the shout out to the Kama Press people. Great job. I also have to admit that I feel I'm lacking a sort of a foreigner's point of view in moderating this event, and I'm counting on you, Larissa, to be my foreign eye. And on that note, before we start with short readings, I'd like to shortly ask Björn and Kristín just one question. If you ever get this standard question in panels like this from non-Icelandic moderators, is there like a standard question that everyone, that you get?
I guess there's always the landscape one. I think it's very fitting that this story that got published in the collection here has become one of the more popular ones to traverse into English. And I think that's probably because it's one of the only ones that actually has a bit of nature in it. Because most of the other stories in the collection sort of take place in the dreary suburbia of Reykjavík, which is where I grew up. So I do find that people want to see landscapes, it seems, or want to hear about how you're inspired by landscape a lot. That's sort of the cliche that probably comes to mind first.
Yeah. How about you, Kristín? Do you get a standard question abroad?
Yeah, the landscape one, and also I'm not sure if I'm asked about this or if I just have the tendency to start talking about it myself, but I feel like I'm always talking about the language itself, Icelandic and translations. But that is also a very big sort of theme in Iceland.
Popular topic.
It is. But we don't speak about it so much, with only local writers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, since I have you here on the big screen, maybe I can ask you to start reading a short passage from your story in the Book of Reykjavik.
The story that is in this anthology is one from a short story collection that I published in 2010. So I wrote it in 2009. So I have been rereading it now and thinking about it a bit, but I hadn't for a long time before this. It's a story about a boy, a young man. He is, I think he is somewhere between 20 and 30, in his 20s, and yeah, it's about him. I'm going to read just a short passage in Icelandic. Einhvern tímann töluðu þau æsku sína. Hún sagði krúttlega sögu af páfagauki og Hafliði, that is the name, the man, Hafliði, sagði langa dramatíska sögu af einhverju sem gerðist þegar hann var í sveit, eitthvað varðandi hund og holgóma lamb sem þurfti að slátra. Stelpan hlustaði athugul og þegar sagan var búin, sagði hún að sér þetta merkilegt hvað hann gerði mikið úr öllu. Eitthvað sem mér hefði ekki fundist neitt mál, sagði hún, skynjar þú eins og rosalega harmleik. Ég geri alveg ráð fyrir að þú hafir átt erfitt, en samt, fjölskylda þín yndisleg, þér gengur vel í skólanum, þér skortir ekkert. Af hverju lætur þú alltaf eins og það sé kraftaverk, að þú hafi lifað af einhverjar hörmungar? Ég meina, hvað gerðist eiginlega? Svona fyrir utan lífið. Ég meina, við þurfum öll að lifa það af. Stundum finnst mér bara eins og vanti á þig eitt húðlag eða eitthvað. Ekki svo löngu eftir þetta samtal fór Hafliði heim til hennar og sagðist vilja að þau væru vinir. Hann væri ekki lengur hrifinn af henni og þegar hún grúfði sig í sófann og grét lagði hann lófann á bakið á henni og fannst eins og allt væri óraunverulegt. Stelpan væri bara enn ein pullan í sófanum sem leystist upp. Veggir stofunnar hrykki hljóðlaust sundur. Húsið allt, jörðin og hann svifi efnislaus í engu. I think that Larissa should now take over, since most of you probably don't understand the word that I'm saying.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read the excerpt that Kristín just read from and just a little bit more after that. One time, when they were talking about their childhoods, she told him a cute anecdote about a parrot, and Hafliði told her a long, dramatic story about something that happened to him once in the countryside. Something about a dog and a lamb with a cleft palate that had to be slaughtered. The girl listened attentively, and when the story was over, she said she thought it was funny how much he made of everything. Something that would have been no big deal to me, she said. You experience some great tragedy. I totally get that you've had troubles, but still, you've got a great family, you do well in school, you want for nothing. Why do you always act like it's a miracle you survived? I mean, what's actually happened to you? Other than life, I mean. We all have to survive that. Sometimes I think you're missing a few layers of skin. Not so long after that conversation, Hafliði went to her place and said he wanted them to be friends. He didn't like her like that anymore, and when she put her head in her hands and cried on the couch, he laid a palm on her back and felt like the whole thing was unreal. The girl was just one more couch cushion that dissolved into nothing as the walls crumbled around them. The entire house, the earth, and him just drifted, disembodied, out into nothingness. The night that girl told him he was missing a few layers of skin, Hafliði got upset and called her a common pleb, said it depressed him the way she trivialized and oversimplified all the things that made human beings remarkable. It bored him, he said, how unimaginative she was, acting like people could be only this or that. He didn't exactly understand why it made him so mad. He got pins and needles all over and wanted, more than anything, to fling himself out the window. And then he got scared. Windows became his enemy. The thought of allowing himself to clamber out one and splotch down on the asphalt below was never far away. It huddled behind all his other thoughts, slimy and hostile, like an organ on the verge of bursting.
Terrific. I think we will go straight to reading. Björn, if you will read now in Icelandic, and then we will have Larissa again, and then start the discussion.
All right, thank you. I should say about this story, obviously maybe it sounded like I was bristling at the mere idea of being inspired by landscape earlier, but I think it's fairly apparent from my reading that I am, in fact, sometimes sort of take from the landscapes around us. And this story in particular takes place in suburbia, but it takes place in sort of one of the many desolate urban areas outside of Reykjavik, because Reykjavik is a young city, but it's growing very fast. So there are these areas where land that used to be just abandoned lava fields are like all of a sudden streets and light poles start sprouting up. And it takes place there. But actually the bit I'm going to read is a flashback within there. Hann hafði einu sinni áður séð villtan ref berum augum. Það var þegar hann var strákur í fjallgöngu með foreldrum sínum. Þau voru að ganga niður í þröngan dal á Vestfjörðum. Í brekkunni hinum megin voru litlir gráir hnoðrar á iði í sólinni. Sjáðu, hafði móðir hans sagt. Hún hengdi kíkinn hálsinn á honum og stýrði honum í rétta átt. Sérðu þá? Yrðlingar, nýskriðnir úr greni. Tófan lá á steini álengdar og fylgdist með. Í gegnum kíkinn horfði hann á yrðlingana slást eins og smástráka undir vökulu auga móður sinnar. Allt þar til tófan varð vör við þau og hóf að smala afkvæmunum ofan í holuna. Hún gaggaði og beit í hnakkan á þeim til að reka á eftir. Þegar þau komu þar að voru engin vegsummerki litlu fjölskylduna, en í kíkinum hafði hann séð hvar inngangurinn í grenið var og lagðist í grasið til að gæjast inn. Faðir hans rykti honum á fætur, svo fast að hann fékk marblett á stærð við tíkall. Ertu vitlaus, strákur, hvæsti pabbans. Ekki vera með puttana þarna. Ef þeir komast í þig, bíta þér og slepp ekki fyrir beinið brotnar. Hann greip utan vísifingur og löngu töng á syni sínum og kreisti þar til strákurinn emjaði af sársauka. Þá sleppti faðir hans, skelkaður og vandræðalegur. Hann hafði alist upp í sveit á Austfjörðum og sem barn hafði hann séð lömb með sundurrifin andlit og augun hangandi út. Heyrt ámátlegt jarmið í kindum sem fundu ekki afkvæmi sín. Ungur hafði hann lært að hata minka og refi eins og aðeins sauðfjárbændur hatast við dýrbíta. Sá í þeim grimmd sem borgarbörnin þekktu ekki. Ef ég hefði verið með byssu, sagði pabbans, síðar sama kvöldið, sitjandi við tjaldinnganginn að hræra í kakói með hnífnum sem hékk í beltinu hans á ferðalögum. Ef ég hefði verið með byssu, hefði ég skotið hana og yrðlingana líka. Refir ættu að vera réttræpir eins og minkar. Ef þeir komast í búfénað verða þeir óðir og hætta ekki fyrr en þeir eru búnir að drepa allt sem þeir ná í. Hann hristi nokkra sykurpúða ofan í rjúkandi bollan og rétti syni sínum, þar sem hann sat í hnipri í gættinni á tjaldinu, hálfur í svefnpoka. Móðir hans var innar í tjaldinu að lesa með hausljósi. Það hafði verið styrt á milli foreldra hans frá því þau rákust á tófuna og honum fannst eins og faðir sinn væri að reyna að ávarpa hana þegar hann þurrkaði hnífinn í skyrtufaldinum og sagði: Svoleiðis gera eðlileg dýr ekki.
Thank you. Okay, so he'd only once before seen a fox in the wild, back when he was a boy, hiking with his parents. They were walking into a narrow valley in the West Fjords, when at the top of the next ridge they caught sight of little gray puffballs wriggling in the sunshine. Look, said his mother. She hung her binoculars around his neck and pointed him in the right direction. Do you see them? Fox cubs, just emerged from their burrow. A vixen lay on a stone some distance away, keeping watch. He looked through the binoculars at the cubs tussling like little boys until their mother noticed the interlopers, yipped, and one by one took her young by the scruff and tossed them into their den. When he and his parents got there, there was no trace of the little family, but he'd seen the burrow's entrance through the binoculars. He lay down in the grass and peered into it. His father grabbed his arm and yanked him sharply to his feet, leaving behind a bruise the size of a 10-krona coin. Have you lost your mind, lad? His father hissed. You can't be dangling your fingers in there. They'll bite and not let go until the bone snaps. He grabbed his son's index and middle fingers and squeezed until the boy whimpered in pain. Then he let go, horrified and shamefaced. His father had grown up in the East Fjords, and as a child had seen lambs with their faces torn apart and eyes hanging out of their sockets, had heard the piteous blinking of a ewe that couldn't find her lambs. He'd learned from a young age to hate minks and foxes that way that only a farmer could, seeing in them a cruelty that city kids could not conceive of. If I'd had a rifle, said his father later that same night, sitting at the entrance of the tent and stirring a mug of hot chocolate with the knife he kept on his belt whenever they went camping. If I'd had a rifle, I would have shot her and her cubs too. Foxes should be shot on sight, just like minks. Any time they run across livestock, they go into a frenzy and they don't stop until they killed everything they can sink their teeth into. He shook a few extra marshmallows into the steaming mug and passed it to his son where he sat curled up in his sleeping bag. His mother was inside the tent, reading by the light of her headlamp. His parents had been short with one another since they'd encountered the vixen, and he felt like his father was really talking to her when he dried his knife on the hem of his shirt and said, "Normal creatures aren't like that."
Thank you, Larissa and Kristín and Björn. I just realized when I was listening to you read that both of you mention lambs in your stories, and that is interesting, I think, because in the forewords by Sjón, he describes a very typical Icelandic conflict, the conflict between the countryside and the city. It's an old one and maybe not current anymore, but it's still very real in some way, and this sense of things being spoiled and corrupt in the city, becoming so even, and then clean and virtuous in the countryside. It's such a strong sense, I think, with maybe our generation. It might have come through children's literature. What do you guys think? Is this something that you think that you have been exposed to reading children's books, that this sense of, and the reason I'm talking about this now is because of this notion about lambs being eaten by foxes and like this protection of the lamb, protection of the sheep. It's a very strong sense, but I have never been so connected myself to the countryside. I don't know if you guys have. Kristín, what do you think? Do you sense where I'm going with this? You're on mute. Mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I absolutely know what you're talking about. I'm not sure in the context of my story there, but I do find it curious that we both talk about it is the same sort of angle there with this city boy in my story that is sort of telling this very everyday sort of event from the countryside. The execution of a lamb with a cleft palate, and he has experienced this as a terrible trauma injury, and that being made fun of a little bit. So I guess that absolutely, I just hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah.
How about you, Björn? Do you see where I'm going with this? Like how we are affected by these children's stories about everything, like these old times in the countryside?
I think it's more than the children's stories. I don't think we as a nation have, as of yet, in our literature, come to grips with sort of the trauma of urbanization, really. Reykjavik is such a young city, and we only have to go 1 or 2 generations back, and people were, there wasn't a city here, and there wasn't the sort of society that you get in a city. It was a farming community. And there's, and if you look at sort of the big sort of new modernist like literature coming out of Iceland in the 1950s, it's all that. It's constantly, boy goes to the city and, runs into some woman who treats him bad, and then he goes back to the country. And we've been in this thing now, it feels, since the 2000s, where I refer to them as the An Icelander Comes Home novels, which are all these novels. Actually, my latest one kind of included. I just didn't realize until afterwards, where like instead of going to the city, it's someone goes outside of Reykjavik, and then it's the return and sort of the trauma of coming back that fits. So yeah, I don't think we're done with sort of that. We're still working over our pains from having sort of lost that connection to the countryside and to the land, I think, even though we won't admit it.
Another thing I realized when preparing for this panel is that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, both of you wrote your stories abroad. Kristín, you in Montreal, and Björn, you in New York. Ish, maybe, I don't know. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, let's say that. So I'm wondering about how that distance affected your writing and your perspective on the city, Björn.
So yeah, I wrote, I guess the sort of early drafts of that story were written in Scotland when I was doing my MFA in creative writing, but the collection itself was completed in New York some years later. And I mean, I had kind of a weird go of it, to be honest, because I always struggled to write in Icelandic, not so much because I wasn't capable, but Icelandic is a very dear thing that people have a very high opinion on, and everybody has a very specific opinion on. And I didn't feel, as a young man in my 20s, sort of first starting writing, I didn't, sadly, I didn't have sort of the strength of character to take that language and sort of mold it and make it my own and make mistakes, which is an integral part of becoming a writer. You have to, if you want to be a writer, you have to write very badly for a long time, because that's how it happens. It doesn't, and I always had a hard time writing badly in Icelandic. But writing badly in English, that's fine. It's a bastard tongue. You can do whatever you want with it. But it did, I should, to sum up, I should say, so I wrote in English, and I wrote, because most of the stories in this collection were a part of my final portfolio at the University of Glasgow, where I did my degree. And I did realize at some point that English had just become this sort of safe zone. This is like a padded room where I wasn't taking risks, and there was something lacking. There was like a screen between the words and the settings somehow. In my case, I'm not saying that's for everyone. There's plenty of Icelandic writers who are absolutely fine writing in English, but in my case, there was a lack of immediacy between the words and the images that I couldn't cross unless sort of going into Icelandic. And I guess by that point I was ready for it, and I had to kind of start all the way from the ground up, and I had to make all those mistakes and get lots and lots of advice from lots and lots of people, which is never a problem. Icelanders are massively opinionated when it comes to correct Icelandic. And sort of just, be sort of naked in front of my countrymen, I guess.
Yeah, today is the National Day of Icelandic. Good to
it
mention.
Is.
Congratulations, y'all. Larissa, I have to throw the ball to you since this topic came up. What is your reaction to what Björn was describing about the Icelandic tongue?
You mean, I think it's an interesting language to step into. I obviously don't have a deeply emotional connection to, I don't have the same emotional connection. I think language is very personal. And I have like a really deep connection with English. So that definitely resonates with me. I feel really strongly, I think as both Björn and Kristín would agree with, I feel very strongly about English, and I feel very strongly about the way that English manifests in my translations, even though I'm conveying somebody else's words, like in their style and their story, like I still have just such like a tactile feeling of how English works and like what I can do with it and where it can stretch, and I love that. I would never be able to do the same in Icelandic. I don't have the same sort of instinct for it, and it doesn't kind of echo inside me in the same way. But it's it's interesting being able to sort of see that manifest in authors, and like because Icelandic authors tend to be very fluent in English, and not just in like the conversational way, but like have like an aesthetics in English. It becomes like a very interesting conversation about, well, you know, I would say it this way, but you would say it this way, and like how do we bridge that? Yeah,
it's also interesting that all of you wrote, have been living in English-speaking countries, except for me, but different ones. So with different dialects, I guess, and different words and everything. But Kristín, I want to still hold you on that question. If that writing these short stories in Montreal affected like your perspective on this story in particular, because I know that not all of your stories in this collection were situated in Iceland, but maybe if you look at this story and the inspiration for that one.
I can't really remember writing this story in particular, but I know that I wrote all of the stories abroad. It was partly in Montreal, and then it was also I was traveling in South America. But all of them are written abroad, and I think that I was doing my master in drawing in Montreal. I didn't finish it, but I always feel like I have to announce that. Because I started writing short stories, and I think that a big part, because before that I had written poetry and sort of, but I started reading short stories in Canada, and I think also in the States and in Canada you have such a strong tradition, and you have such great short story collections there by writers who only write short stories, and I hadn't actually thought about that before. I thought, you know, first I write poetry, and then maybe one day I will write a novel. But in Canada there seemed to be like this sort of interlude, like the people would start off with writing short story collections, and a lot of the people around me were doing that. So I would go, and it was a cultural thing also.
Yeah, it's a good point. I haven't really thought about that perspective about short stories. I mean, that is not a huge thing. It's a kind of recently become a big thing in Iceland with short stories. So you were way before the wave. I want to ask you a little bit more about this story in particular. When I was reading it, all of a sudden I felt like it was a play on gender roles in a way, because it's a very neurotic guy, and in the beginning he like describes his anxiety, and I realized that I just like I didn't take it seriously until the end. When a woman's voice comes and says like, I'm only half without you. And then I was like, wait a minute, something is odd here. Yeah, so I don't have a question maybe, but do you have a comment on this, like this anxiety and gender in particular maybe, and this notion on women and being half and whole, and what are your thoughts after having read the story again yourself?
Yeah, it's actually hard to be concrete in talking about this in regards to this specific story, but I think that definitely what was sort of in the back of my mind at the time, and I can sort of sense that, is it's very cinematic, and it's sort of this. I think all of these sort of indie films from the time, and this sort of it's a sort of it's a take on a sort of almost like a stereotype of this sort of American indie protagonist male person. And I think that also I was playing with that sort of distance. I'm ridiculing him a little bit, which sort of like yeah. So yeah, definitely I am sort of playing with that there. But yeah, like I said, it's hard to be concrete. So I will stop talking now.
Larissa, how did this story strike you when you first read it?
I felt like I could see it playing out before me, which I always find very interesting because I'm not a very visual reader. But it did actually feel quite cinematic to me, and I could sort of see him prowling around his apartment, looking down on the street, and like I've watched those like packs of young women kind of running into each other as they're like on their way to or from the bar, and I also just felt I found his anxiety humorous, but also kind of moving because it spirals so quickly. Like he's nervous about going out because he might run into somebody who's at this dinner party that he didn't go to, which is definitely a possibility. And then he's nervous about like an airplane falling on him, and then he's got all of this like pent up anxiety about like these suicidal thoughts that he's having, and you can kind of see it just snowballing. And I think most people have been in a spiral like that, and it just felt very recognizable. And I also just like that so much of the meat of the story is just a conversation, just like the way that people interact in like an unexpected conversation. And I think that that's often when you get those like little moments tend to be the moments that you get a lot of truth out of people, in what they're saying and what they're not saying. And so it's a wonderful story.
Agree. I think it's a very, very wonderful story. And in some way it describes a very like it describes the Reykjavik atmosphere very precisely, and this nightlife anxiety and this anxiety about possibly running into someone. I mean, this is real. You will run into them. Yes. So both of the protagonists in these stories we heard, they are kind of lost, and they both seem to need a woman to make them whole again, or to find them. I think that's a really funny common thing there. But Björn, what was that? Was that because when I was reading about your short story collection, and the critics said that it was about decisions that were made and affected the whole life of the protagonists. Can you jump into the discussion about women-men relationships, being half, being whole? Where do you come into that?
I mean, I think it plays in, definitely, because I mean, a lot of the dynamics in these short stories are to do with sort of dynamics of power between men and women. But the general theme, I think, was just these ideas that I was processing and sort of like looking at about guilt. and about guilt in particular, whether it's something assigned by society or assigned by, some official body, or guilt as just this very private thing that we don't necessarily share with anyone. And I think a lot of there are larger things at play also in this collection. But the sort of thing that drove me on was this idea about just the little things that just haunt us, that we feel, where we felt we kind of failed as human beings. We didn't do the right thing. We didn't. And it's also, and how they often become sort of your own personal cross to bear. I mean, there's been a discussion, a big and needed discussion, I think, of late in society about sort of like whether you have the right to re-traumatize a person by apologizing to them or like asking their forgiveness, and sort of ideas of that. And so I think a lot of the people in these stories, they carry their guilt with them as like a secret side of them that nobody gets to see. That it's entirely your own. It's yours to carry, and even the person who you may feel you infringed upon, it doesn't even belong to them, I don't think. And I think in this one, this is probably one of the sort of more quiet ones, because I mean, all it is, like literally the whole story, even though I just read the flashback, is it's a man who wakes up in the middle of the night and next to his wife, and he goes out and runs into a fox and like smokes a cigarette and then goes back, and that's it. And I was probably rather inspired by the Raymond Carver story about the woman who wakes up in the night and goes out and runs into her neighbor, actually, when I think about it, who's poisoning slugs, if I remember correctly. Beautiful story. But the larger thing is just that this marriage, there's this silence that has kind of come over this marriage, just this general horrible, thick silence that nobody knows how to break, and they're not fighting anymore, and they've lost the ability to break that silence that's sort of like strung between them. And I guess the story ends with the two of them having like a brief little moment where they get to sort of abandon, because it's the middle of the night and he sort of had this recent experience, and they get to have this little moment where they experience something of, things before that silence settled over their house. And the story sort of leaves him wondering whether whether they'll remember it in the morning, or whether like things will be back, or whether actually this was something significant that happened there, even though nothing really happened, I guess. So I don't know whether that touches necessarily on gender dynamics, but he is definitely sort of pulled by this sort of, I think it's a very man thing of like, he desperately wants something from his wife, but he has no idea what it is. He wants some tenderness that he is incapable of asking her for.
Yeah, you feel a deep sadness reading this, and yeah, you feel for it. This poor guy, really. I'm not surprised by people asking you about landscape and nature reading the story, because there's a really sharp shift from like complete and almost absurd materialism when he's like thinking and gazing into the lava, thinking about them building this house and filling it with expensive furniture, and then like poof, he's looking at a fox. So it's just like, it's like such a sharp shift of like us being completely cut off from nature and like sucked into it again. And this last, I think it was the last sentence you read, normal creatures aren't like that. The father said there's something about in the story accepting a creature or a person as they are, I think. Do you agree?
I think so. I mean, I would have to think about that a little bit. I do enjoy that, because I've spoken about this story a lot recently because of this publication, which has been really a joyous, fun thing, and it's been very enjoyable how the very different things that people seem to take from it. But there is definitely, I think it is that accepting, but it's also accepting the fact that the, you know, here's an animal that he can't personify. Here's an animal that is wild and doesn't exist in the same world that he does, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Larissa, did you ever see a fox here in Iceland when you were living here?
I have not seen a fox in person. I held a puffin, but I haven't seen a fox. Yeah.
Well, how did the translation process with this book? Was there anything with this story? Was there anything in particular that like comes to mind that was like a challenge?
I think something that happens a lot, but which I do remember with this story, was trying to sort of leave little breadcrumbs that give some context that's not going to come across in the actual writing. Like this story feels like very much like after the crash, and like these descriptions of like the it talks about these what are they called, lampposts that don't have the heads on them, and I've seen these, like, but I had never actually paid attention to them, which I always think is an interesting thing where like I read something that I'm translating, I'm like, oh yeah, like I know exactly what that is, but I hadn't noticed it ever before. And I wasn't in Iceland like right after the crash, but I think you can see these sort of like languages or these neighborhoods that kind of pop up, and they either go up super fast or they don't go up at all, or they, you know, and then are just sort of left in these partially finished conditions. But so kind of getting at that sort of stuff is always an interesting challenge to me. And there's not always a lot you can do, I guess, except to like, you know, you can stick in little like tags here and there to be like to add some context. But sometimes it's just about that moment of recognition, like, oh yes, these lampposts that I never paid attention to, this indicates this, and this is kind of a gentle symbol of all of these other things and reflective of this larger context, and I need to be in that headspace and know that that's where I'm coming from and that's where the story is coming from in order to kind of get those little feelers out elsewhere in the story. And I think that when I was back in like the sands of time when I was an undergraduate studying creative writing, they told me I had an instructor tell me that I should always know the answers to the questions that the characters have, or I should always have a backstory, even if that doesn't come across in the story. And so I sometimes think that is quite applicable to translation too. It's like I know the backstory, or I need to try to know the backstory. I need to ask the questions about the backstory, so that just that knowledge kind of imbues like the words that I'm choosing and the way that I phrase it and the things that I kind of try to highlight a little bit more in the translation. And it's a very subtle thing.
So you're referring then to like the story of this time frame, kind of with the crash and everything like that.
Yeah.
But on that note, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you, Kristín, because your stories are very different with the endings. Björn kind of built, as he said himself, it's a very like soft, slow story, or not slow, just like it's a calm story. And then they go back to sleep. And it's like, it leaves you with a feeling. But your story, it leaves you with like a, what? I forgot my question. The backstory. Do you know, because you said you don't remember writing the story, but what is the feeling you get when you read it again? Do you know Haflið's backstory?
His back, I do, but in a very sort of, I don't think it would sound very smart if I tried to explain it. I think that's why I had to write the story, because sometimes you have these things that they make sense to you, but you know, as soon as you try to make sense of it, you're left alone in the world. So you make up these stories that confuse people, But they do get a sense of where you're at, so you're a little bit less alone, maybe.
Yeah, because you
Yeah.
get really confused because you introduce like 3 different women through the story, and then like a random phone call and a very unrecognizable woman voice. Could be one of those 3, or could be someone totally different. But you still, as a reader, you kind of get hoping, and that's also a very interesting feeling to be left with.
I think he has this. He has a very strong sort of yearning, and I think also that anxiety and yearning are very, they're very similar. So it's sort of like if looking forward to something can be very similar to anxiety, and yearning for something can be very sort of anxious. So that's also a part of the thing. He is isolated and sort of desperate.
Yeah.
But yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a very good point. I just realized recently that you can hope so hardly, and you can like feel that you've let go of life. Like I've let go, but I'm just hoping, and then I can't control anything, but I still hope. But then you realize I'm trying to control with hoping.
Yeah.
Kind of like what he's doing. But I think we now have some time for questions from the audience. I will try to find, Laura is asking, what is that story that Björn mentioned that is similar to his story with poisoning slugs and so on?
Yeah. Larissa, I think you had the title there somewhere.
Yeah, I Googled it. I couldn't remember the title either. I'm pretty sure it's I Could See the Smallest Things by Raymond Carver.
Yeah, I think that's the one. I had a big thing with Raymond Carver for a while there when I was in my 20s. It was his collection. I mean, you read lots of books, and you read lots of books that make you, want to write and hope to write, or like think you can't write. Probably you read most of those books. But what we talk about when we talk about love was the first book that I read that I thought, oh, well, maybe I have a voice too in some way.
I just realized that, Larissa, you already answered this question in the chat. Then Faith comments that she lives in New Jersey and has a fox family. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. We don't have any more questions. So maybe, Larissa, I would like to ask you why you picked Icelandic as your language of translation.
Because it's super practical. I came to Icelandic through a very roundabout way, but the short answer to this is that I was very taken before I had ever been to Iceland. Like, I didn't come to Iceland through the sagas. I didn't come to Iceland through the nature. Not a lot of like the sort of typical things that I wasn't like overly obsessed with Björk. Like I just I read something somewhere that talked about this small nation of people who were obsessed with books, and I thought, like, okay, like that's definitely worth investigating. And I was kind of on a mission to find a language that I wanted to translate from, because I had studied Spanish and I was very mediocre at Spanish. And I was looking for a language that had like a strong literary tradition, and that maybe there weren't as many people translating from, so that, I could kind of have a niche and do some good there. And Icelandic really exceeded my expectations in that respect. Like there was no world that I conceived of being able to be a full-time translator. Like I never thought that this was going to be like a job that I had. Like I thought that I was going to be a public librarian and then like maybe get to do one book in the course of my lifetime, which would have been actually great. But it's a really wonderful and unusual thing to be able to spend so much time in a culture and a language that is just so happily literary, and that there's such variety to it too.
I want to, because you mentioned before, I know you mentioned to me that sometimes it's difficult to work with Icelanders because they're so opinionated, and everyone here has talked about this as well. I don't remember if it was online or before. Maybe I'm talking too much now. But how I forgot my question again. Because you're translated into English, and I mean everyone in Iceland speaks English. How difficult is it? Like, do you have to like throw stuff back and forth? Is it? Can you describe the situation?
It always depends on the person, and I am mostly poking fun. It's a very different relationship than I think exists with a lot of my colleagues who translate into languages that people just don't speak, that their authors don't speak. And in some ways, I think because I am translating into a language that is so commonly spoken, a lot of people, basically anyone who speaks English feels like they have an ownership of English, which I think is one of like the really interesting things about the language. And I learn more about English by listening to the way that people talk about like their relationship with English and their opinions on English and how English should look and how English should sound. And like this is all, it all really informs the way that I think about my language too. But I also have a safety net, I would say, because Icelanders speak English so well. But like if I was translating into Latvian, nobody could tell me if I got it wrong. So like I think that like there is that's a gift, because like I didn't start studying Icelandic until I was 28 years old, and I still have a complicated relationship with my spoken Icelandic. I can do it, but it's not like artistic or like hugely nuanced. So I think that I really appreciate that I can have these conversations, and it's not always without like debates, but that's good for me too. Like I have to think about the choices that I'm making, and I have to be willing to like have those arguments, and I also need to learn how to when those arguments are important, I feel, but I also need to learn how to kind of give up that control and trust people when they say they know their work and they know what they want with their work. Like it's a good balance. Like you can get very caught in the cycle of thinking that you are the utmost authority, and I think that it's good that as a translator I have to be humble in that way too, and just listen to the authors as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I guess it's a very like a whole. It has to be a whole conversation, because, as you mentioned before, you are English by heart. It resonates with me.
Yeah.
We have questions coming in right now. What are each of your thoughts on proper Icelandic? Should it change to stay alive, or does that risk losing something of its character? I picked this question because of today, and we're almost out of time. Kristín, what do you think about this? Should Icelandic change to stay alive, or should we protect it to protect its character?
It will change. It changes. It's impossible to protect the language in our sort of. You need to isolate people. It needs to be in order for the language to sort of develop slowly, as it did for a long time, but now it is changing, and also a lot of people live in Iceland who are not born in Iceland, so languages are also sort of intertwining with Icelandic, and I feel very optimistic about it. I think that it's just going to be very interesting to see how our language will sort of develop.
Yeah,
and I think we also need to sort of learn from like when I was trying to write in English, I got this when I was living in Montreal. I was writing something in English, and a friend of mine who was native tongue is English, he was reading it and he didn't correct it a lot, and I was, but it's all it's all wrong, and he said, no, but that's your English, so he was respectful of my wrong English, and I love that, and I think that's an attitude
Yeah, that's kind of starting to happen also in Iceland, that papers being published in foreign Icelandic, and I think that's a really good thing to open it up a bit. Björn, what are your thoughts?
I very much agree with Kristín. I mean, I think it's crazy to even think that Iceland isn't changing Icelandic isn't changing all the time. And I also had a similar thing where, because I did most of my sort of early experiences as a writer in the UK, and I never had a problem getting English-speaking readers to tell me whether a scene was working or a character was working. But I found it completely impossible. It took a long while to find Icelanders who would tell me about like scenes or settings or characters, because they would only look at language constantly. It was this strange thing where they felt like as long as the language was perfect, the book was perfect. It didn't really matter what it was about. It was fine. It was good language equaled, good fiction, which I didn't necessarily agree with, seeing as I didn't have good language. So I think we're at the cusp of a very interesting time. We're finally getting like immigrant voices in our literature. We've had immigrants for, a very long time, and they've been completely just kept out, absent from our publishing worlds. And that's, that's the easiest way to stagnate. I mean, there are, even though people here read a lot, I mean, just like everywhere, reading numbers are falling, obviously. So, and we don't want to become, a cultural scene that just writes solely for itself, even though one of our strengths is the fact that we do write we chase our own bliss in our writing, I think. But it's not fun if you have to get new people in, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, the definition of something that is alive is change also. I mean, we change constantly through life. Larissa, to you. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, I do think we could do a better job at teaching kids to sort of like take ownership of Iceland. I mean, I think that's why they sort of run away into English quite a lot at a young age, because they're just, I mean, I guess I experienced this in the way that I talked about earlier, is that you become sort of afraid because people are constantly sort of hitting your fingers and telling you you're doing it wrong and you're not speaking the correct way. And like, we need to instill in kids the fact that they can take ownership of their language, that it's theirs and they can do what they want with it.
Yeah, it's the fear of the language going extinct. Absolutely. Larissa, I think so. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Oh, I mean, I love, I think I said this even earlier today, like I think that part of like one of the things that's so great about English is that it's so flexible and so stretchy, and it's a magpie language. It steals from everywhere, and it's an accented language. It's a language that gets written incorrectly. It's a language that gets played with all the time, and I feel like that's one of the things that it does well. I think it means that you can kind of capture a number of different voices and experiences, and I think that all languages can do that. I think if you get too obsessed with the purity of something, then like you're saying, like you don't feel like you can play with it. You don't feel like you can experiment in it. And actually, I think Icelandic is a really colorful and flexible language in its own way. I think it like that changes. That's different than how it works in English. But I am delighted when I see somebody do something really weird with Icelandic, because it's like you can kind of like, particularly on the page, like to see written Icelandic varies, and you guys can both correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think it varies quite significantly from spoken Icelandic. There's like a very different cadence. There's a very different just snappiness to spoken Icelandic. And so like I'm a sucker for seeing that on the page too. And I love to see the way that people play with that. And it's exciting to translate, which means it's exciting to read. And I think that's all great.
Yeah, so to not be afraid for the language to evolve and change. And that's maybe the key to keeping it alive. We're out of time. This was a great fun to be with you guys. And we were discussing the Book of Reykjavik from Kama Press, and I recommend this book. I was impressed reading this. I thought it was really well put together, and the foreword and introduction also excellent. We didn't have time to discuss those. But thank you so much, Kristín Eiríksdóttir, Larissa Kyzer, and Björn Halldórsson for this evening or day of discussion. I don't know what time it is in the States.
Thanks, Halla.
Thank you, Halla, for moderating, and thank you, Björn and Kristín and Larissa for participating, and thank you, audience, for tuning in. Yes, so please do visit the website scandinavias.org. We have some interesting things coming up. We have a lot more literary programs coming up in the new year, which seems weird to say right now, but it is, I guess, mid-November or mid-November. So yeah, so please do visit us. Scandinavias is open, but we are doing a lot of virtual programs as well. So we hope to see everyone soon, and everyone have a good day. Okay, bye.